All right, so we now understand contractionary and expansionary fiscal policy. And we know that when there is an example of the use of contractionary or expansionary fiscal policy, we don't need to spend the entire amount of the gap. So in this example, which is where we left off, I believe, we were trying to make up $100 billion gap. But of course, because one person's spending is another person's income, if the government spent 100 billion, we would actually have a much larger impact. And it's because of this multiplier effect. So we've talked about this example before, where Bobby spends money and then his spending becomes Jason's income, becomes Nancy's income, and et cetera, et cetera. So our increase in consumer spending is much more than the original change of 100. In this example, it's 300, but of course that, assumes that that Nancy, doesn't spend anything after this, okay? So let's instead look at how we can really do this. So let's say the government spends $5 million. We know that it's not going to go up by only $5 million. It's going to go up by some amount based on how much that $5 million is spent and then spent again and then spent again. So the other thing is we know that not everybody spends every dollar that they have. So what we talk about is what's called the marginal propensity to consume. Okay, so it's marginal, which we know is going to be about changes. So when you get an extra dollar, how much extra, when you get an extra dollar, that should be down here. Okay, so when you get an extra dollar in income, what is your change in spending? Do you spend all 100 pennies of it, or do you keep some amount? So, typically we save some amount, right? And that is why we also have what's called our marginal propensity to save. So our change in saving over our change in income. Now, of course, every penny that you get is either saved, okay? So all money is either spent or it is saved. And that's a really important idea. And that's why we know that MPS is 1 minus MPC, okay? Since you can either spend or you can consume, you can either save or you can consume. Those are really your only two choices. Even investing, like buying stocks and bonds, that is consuming. You're just consuming stocks and bonds rather than, food and cars. But for all intents and purposes, it's the same thing. When we talk about saving, we're talking about putting the money into a bank. Okay, that's what we mean when we talk about saving, getting the money into the lending system. And we'll talk about that more later on. So now let's talk a little bit more about how exactly this is multiplied. So, let's assume that we have an MPC of 0.5. So people spend 50 cents of every dollar that they get. So the first $100 becomes $50 in the second round, which becomes $25, which becomes $12.50, which becomes $6.25, which becomes $3.13, etc. So we could do infinity iterations of that because we know that it's getting half as big every time. But sort of like taking a step toward a wall where every step is half as big as the previous one, you will never touch the wall. So we're not going to do it that way. We could either do calculus or we could just do a very simple formula. But first, let's just do some basics. Our change in GDP equals our multiplier, which we're about to learn how to find, times the initial change in spending. Okay, so if our MPC is 0.5, then for our simple multiplier, all we do is take our MPS or 1 minus our MPC. Now, of course, they are the same because we chose 0.5. And that gives us a multiplier of what? Well, 1 over 0.5 equals 2. Okay, so in that example. Now, in the example here in the PowerPoint, we have a multiplier of 0.4, which would mean that we had an MPS of 0.25. or 1 minus MPC, so this would be, MPC would then be 0.75, which would equal 0.25. That would give us 1 over 0.25 gives us this spending multiplier of 4. So our 5 billion in government spending, change in government spending, times our multiplier of 4 gives us a change of GDP of $20 billion. Okay, so that's really what we're looking at. In practical times, we're going to have relatively simple multipliers. Okay, so you've got 0.9, 0.8, 0.5, things like that. Throw in a 0.75, just the math is going to be pretty simple. But here is the thing. As marginal propensity to consume falls, the multiplier effect is less. So if the government is trying to stimulate the economy, expansionary fiscal policy, what they should want, what that means is the more we spend of an extra dollar received, the bigger the multiplier effect will be. So obviously what we're trying to do here is take ourselves from this recessionary gap and push back to full employment. Okay, that's always going to be the goal. So what we figure out then is what is our MPC, okay? And if our MPC is 0.8, then we want to go back to our formula, 1 over MPS, or 1 over 1 minus MPC. So 1 over 1 minus 0.8 equals 1 over 0.2, which equals 5. Okay, so our gap is 500 billion that we're trying to achieve, and our multiplier is 5 times x. Okay, so that means that x equals $100 billion. So that is the amount that we need to change. Okay, that's the change that the government needs to have in expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, now contractionary fiscal policy is the same way. We have an inflationary gap of 20 billion, and it looks like our MPC here is 0.5, which is going to give us a multiplier of, do the math in your head, 2, that's right. So so we need a change of negative 20 billion, and that equals 2, which is our multiplier, times x. So that means x equals negative 10 billion, and there you have it. Now, we are talking about changes in spending, both positive and negative changes in spending. But we know that the other tool in the toolbox of fiscal policy is changes in taxation. Now, one would assume that a change in taxes and a change in spending would be the same, but that is not actually the case. And the reason for that is if the government gives you a tax cut rather than, and like a tax rebate where they send you a check like we've been discussing, that is a tax rebate. It is not government spending. Government spending is when the government goes out and buys things directly from the market. If they give you a check, the first thing you're going to do is save a portion of it, right? So if there's, if they write $10 billion worth of checks, how much gets spent? Right? And if we spend 0.75, then that means that only 7.5 billion ever gets spent. Right? In that first round, because the first thing we do is save. Okay? Whereas if the government takes that same $10 billion and it just buys every government employee a car, now, I'm not saying that would be a good use of money, but if they buy every government employee a car, then $10 billion gets spent versus $7.5 billion gets spent. Okay? So what that means is we have a different multiplier. The simple multiplier is 1 over is 1 over MPC, right? Or I'm sorry, 1 over MPS, or 1 over, here, let's get it up here. 1 over MPS, or 1 over 1 minus MPC. But our tax multiplier is going to be different. Our tax multiplier has to be smaller. So we're going to use MPC over MPS. Okay, so let's use the same. The simple multiplier is 1 over 0.25, which equals 4. But the tax multiplier is going to be 0.75 over 0.25, which equals 3. That's obviously smaller. Okay, so the idea here is it may make sense to give people the tax cut, right? But money that goes directly from the government to people, the first thing that happens is money leaks out due to saving. So the multiplier is smaller. Okay, so why would the government ever want to do that? Knowing that they're moving the economy less than they would if they did it directly themselves. And the answer typically is some kind of politics or an ideological belief that people are going to spend money than the government, or the ways that the government will spend money are less efficient or whatever. And all of that might be true, but the math is relatively undeniable. Now let's switch to our non-discretionary fiscal policy. So we're just talking about discretionary fiscal policy, but let's keep in mind that not everything is discretionary. There are plenty of fiscal stabilizers which are automatic. And we've talked about the income tax system already. So it acts counter-cyclically to stabilize the economy. When the economy is down, the tax burden on consumers is lower, which will promote consumption and increase aggregate demand, or at least decrease it less than it would if people were paying more in taxes. Likewise, when GDP rises, the tax burden is larger, which tends to discourage consumption. And if we're worried about an inflationary gap, then that is what we want. Okay, so the more progressive the tax system, the greater the economy's built-in stability. Low taxes will tend to lead to more instability. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't have low taxes, but that's, again, just a fact of mathematics. And obviously, we already discussed things like welfare and other automatic stabilizers, unemployment insurance, and things like that. Now, fiscal policy sounds great, right? We've just done all this math and we've shown that we can change the economy, but there are some problems. First of all, if there's a recessionary gap, then we're going to have deficit spending. Okay, so if taxes go down and spending goes up, then unless we started with a massive surplus, we're going to push ourselves into deficit spending. Okay, now we should know by now that a deficit is when spending exceeds revenue. So remember, revenue for the government is taxes and spending is spending. So if spending exceeds tax revenue, then we have a budget deficit. And of course, all deficits minus surpluses equals debt. Okay, so the national debt is a combination of all the previous deficits added together and then all of the previous surpluses subtracted from that. Now there's interest and things, obviously getting paid off, but that's the most basic idea. So budget deficits, typically most mainstream economists believe that the deficit is a necessary evil. It's something that has to happen because doing nothing is pretty problematic, since the government has a role in stimulating the economy. Or, the opposite is true too. Budget surpluses are important in order to cool the economy down. Okay, so a lot of states don't do this because a lot of states have constitutional amendments that require a balanced budget, which actually winds up putting more pressure on the federal government to do, any kind of intervention, because the states themselves generally can't do it. Some states can, but most cannot. Missouri cannot, for example. Now, in addition to the possibility of long-term budget deficits and therefore debt. There are lags. So the recognition lag, the administrative lag, and the operational lag are all important problems with fiscal policy. We've talked about this before. If we're in a recession, we don't know it for 3 to 6 months after we are in it. We can guess, but it just takes a while to collect the data. Now, administrative lag, particularly now, you guys know that Congress is not doing that great of a job passing any legislation quickly. So it takes a while to do that. Even if everybody knows what should happen, if it takes a long time for it to happen, then that's going to lengthen the the time of the recession. And then finally, operational lag. And this is just whatever happens then needs to filter through the economy. It doesn't immediately happen. It filters through to have an effect, right? Just because the government sends out those checks doesn't mean that the economy immediately picks up. We have to do stuff. And then another problem, of course, is, what can be called pork. But just because the legislation happens doesn't mean that it is always in the long-term best interest of the nation as a whole. It might only impact certain constituencies. And of course, typically that is related to getting reelected. All right, and this is another big one, crowding out. So crowding out appears on the AP test all the time, and crowding out just means that if the government is borrowing, then that means that there's less money out there for private citizens to borrow. Okay, we're going to talk more about this when we get into the lending market, but you can imagine if I go to the bank to borrow, $200,000 to buy a house, and the bank has already taken all of its money and essentially loaned it to the government, then that's going to mean I can't get my loan, or at least the interest rates are going to rise and my loan will be more expensive. Okay, so that is a possibility. You can read through the rest of this with a quick pause. And then this one is something that we won't really talk about now, but the net export effect basically will do some of these things as well. It'll all make a lot more sense once we get into exports, when we study the international economy later. But for the time being, you can just pause and read this. Thanks, gentlemen. Have a good day.